Friends, imagine waking up to a headline that doesn't feel like news, but like a rupture in history itself, a moment so abrupt and so deliberate that it forces you to question everything you thought was stable about the modern world. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing, and let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect! Now enjoy the video, because reports begin to surface that the United States has ordered European Union diplomats to pack their bags and leave Washington, not as part of some routine reshuffle, not hidden behind bureaucratic language, but as a direct and unmistakable signal that something fundamental has broken inside the most powerful alliance on Earth. Within hours, confusion turns into urgency as officials scramble behind closed doors, embassies begin issuing quiet instructions, and a single line leaks from inside the State Department suggesting that diplomatic status is under immediate review. A phrase so technical on the surface, yet so explosive in meaning, that seasoned analysts instantly recognize it as a warning shot fired across the Atlantic. As the story begins to spread, major outlets like and frame the development as unprecedented, while policy experts tied to caution that this could mark the beginning of a structural shift in global power dynamics, not just another diplomatic disagreement. Because what is unfolding is not about personalities or temporary disputes, but about the deeper question of who gets to define the rules of the international system in an era where economic power, regulatory reach, and political sovereignty are increasingly colliding. And at the centre of this collision stands, on one side and on the other, two figures whose visions of the global order are not just different, but fundamentally incompatible. To understand how the situation escalated to this point, you have to look beyond the immediate headlines and into the slow accumulation of tension that has been building for years. And because this confrontation did not begin with a single meeting or a single policy dispute, but with a growing sense inside Washington that the European Union had evolved from a cooperative partner into a regulatory superpower capable of shaping global markets in ways that directly affect American industries. One policy in particular became the focal point of this frustration, a mechanism known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, which Brussels designed as a tool to ensure that imported goods face the same environmental costs as products manufactured within Europe, a policy framed as both a climate solution and an economic safeguard. From the perspective of CBAM represents a necessary evolution of global trade rules. Art an attempt to align economic incentives with environmental responsibility while protecting European industries from unfair competition. But from the perspective of and his advisors, the same policy looks like something entirely different, a sophisticated form of protectionism disguised as environmental policy. One that effectively imposes financial penalties on American exports ranging from steel to aluminum to heavy manufacturing, sectors that are deeply tied to domestic political support and economic identity in the United States. This difference in interpretation is where the real conflict begins, because it transforms what could have been a technical trade disagreement into a broader ideological clash over sovereignty and control. And with Washington increasingly viewing Brussels not as a partner operating within a shared system, but as an actor attempting to rewrite the rules of that system in ways that disadvantage American interests. According to insiders, this perception hardened significantly after a series of internal reviews within the Trump administration concluded that EU regulatory frameworks, including digital taxation policies and aggressive antitrust actions against American technology firms, were systematically targeting US economic power under the guise of fairness and consumer protection. The turning point came quietly, almost invisibly to the public, during a closed-door meeting on March 11, 2026, where senior officials reviewed a classified assessment of transatlantic relations in a document that reportedly carried a stark conclusion, stating that the European Union could no longer be treated as a neutral partner. a line that immediately reframed the entire relationship and set in motion a chain of decisions that would soon spill into the public domain. What followed was not an impulsive reaction, but a calculated shift in strategy, one that moved from negotiation to pressure, from cooperation to confrontation, as the administration began exploring ways to challenge the EU's institutional presence in Washington itself. This is where the issue of diplomatic status becomes critical, because the European Union's delegation in the United States operates with privileges that resemble those of a sovereign embassy. Even though the EU is not a nation state, but a political and economic union of 27 countries. And that arrangement has long been a symbol of the bloc's unique role in global governance. Altering or revoking that status would not simply be a bureaucratic adjustment, but a direct challenge to the EU's legitimacy as a unified international actor, a move that carries both symbolic and practical consequences, and one that signals a willingness by Washington to redefine the terms of engagement at the highest level. Back in Europe, the reaction is immediate but far from unified, as calls for calm and dialogue while simultaneously preparing contingency plans. Yet key figures such as and pursue their own approaches, maintaining separate channels with Washington and signalling varying degrees of alignment with Trump's perspective, a divergence that exposes a fundamental vulnerability within the European Union. But because its strength on the global stage depends on unity, and without it, its negotiating power begins to erode. As markets begin to react, the economic implications of the standoff become impossible to ignore, with volatility spreading across currencies, equities, and commodities, as investors attempt to price in the risk of a deeper transatlantic rift, a risk that carries enormous weight, given that the United States and the European Union together account for a substantial portion of global GDP and maintain one of the largest bilateral trade relationships in history. Any disruption to this relationship would not remain confined to diplomatic circles, but would cascade through supply chains, impact production costs, alter consumer prices, and ultimately affect millions of ordinary people on both sides of the Atlantic. Amid this growing uncertainty, reports emerge that Brussels is preparing a targeted response, one that mirrors strategies used in previous trade disputes, but on a potentially larger scale, focusing on politically sensitive American exports in order to maximize domestic pressure within the United States. A tactic designed not just to retaliate economically, but to influence the internal political calculus of the Trump administration. This approach reflects a broader reality that both sides are now operating under significant political constraints, with committed to an economic narrative centred on protecting American sovereignty and correcting perceived imbalances, while is equally committed to maintaining the EU's position as a regulatory superpower capable of setting global standards. What makes the situation particularly volatile is that neither leader can easily retreat without undermining their own credibility, creating a scenario in which escalation becomes more likely than compromise, even as the risks continue to grow. Yet beneath the surface of this confrontation, a different set of conversations is taking place, largely hidden from public view, involving military officials and defence planners who understand that while economic and diplomatic tensions can be managed, a complete breakdown of cooperation would have far-reaching implications for global security. These quiet discussions highlight the enduring importance of NATO and the broader security architecture that has linked the United States and Europe since the aftermath of World War II. An architecture built on shared interests and mutual dependence that cannot be easily dismantled without creating new vulnerabilities. As a result, even as political rhetoric intensifies and economic measures are considered, there remains an underlying recognition that certain lines cannot be crossed without triggering consequences that extend far beyond trade or diplomacy. At the same time, the current crisis is already reshaping strategic thinking within Europe, prompting countries to reassess their reliance on American leadership and explore greater autonomy in defence and economic policy. A shift that could have long-term implications for the balance of power within the Western alliance. This evolving dynamic suggests that what we are witnessing is not simply a temporary dispute, but a deeper transformation in the nature of transatlantic relations. One that reflects broader changes in the global order and the distribution of influence among major actors. As the situation continues to develop, the key question remains unresolved. Is this confrontation a calculated negotiating tactic aimed at extracting concessions, or is it the beginning of a more permanent realignment that will redefine the relationship between the United States and the European Union for years to come? The answer to that question will depend on decisions being made in real time, often behind closed doors, by individuals whose choices carry significant weight and whose motivations are shaped by a complex mix of political, economic, and strategic considerations. And so, as you watch this story unfold, consider the stakes involved and the potential paths forward, because the outcome will not only determine the future of a long-standing alliance, but also influence the broader trajectory of global politics in an increasingly uncertain world. Will Washington follow through on its signals and fundamentally alter the status of EU representation? Or will diplomatic channels reopen in time to prevent a deeper rupture? Will Brussels escalate its response and risk further fragmentation within its own ranks? Or will it seek a compromise that preserves both its principles and its partnerships? And perhaps most importantly, what happens to the global system if the two largest economic powers can no longer find common ground? These are not abstract questions, but immediate realities, and the answers are coming faster than anyone expected. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve and understand what happens next before it becomes headline news, make sure you stay tuned, because the next move in this unfolding crisis may change everything.